Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Coll, and I'm sorry not to be with you in Cambridge as I was so hoping to be for this conference. Obviously, happening at a very poignant time, and I'm sure as others have reflected, the life of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the ideas that he exemplified and wrestled with in his lifetime resonate in such poignant ways this month when we're watching the Taliban begin the second emirate and seize control of Kabul and at least contest for control in the Panjshir. And I'm sure others have reflected about these events. I'm sorry not to be there to sit down and hear from others what they're thinking about. I thought my engagement with the life of Ahmad Shah Massoud started with my life as a newspaper reporter. Encountered him as a Washington Post reporter in Kabul during the period after the Najibullah government, and primarily during that time when he was defense minister. And then again, of course, after 2001, trying to pull together some of the history of the events that led up to 9/11. And I was thinking about just these brief remarks in light of the summer we've all been through. And I thought about his biography primarily and how it does still resonate as we try to understand the events of this summer, but also think about alternative futures to the one that now looms so darkly in Kabul and across the country. You know, there's so many ways to think about Ahmad Shah Massoud's life and so many chapters of it that are of really enduring interest on their own terms and because of the way they influenced global events. But I thought I went back over my own work and the work of some others to think about what particularly for me speaks to this moment we're in reference to Afghanistan itself in his life. And so I just thought I would mention 5 things very quickly. One is his biography itself, and others may have mentioned this, but I've always carried around the reflection that his father's life and therefore his childhood was really embedded in a time in Afghanistan between the 1930s and the 1960s that the post 9/11 discourse about the country, certainly in the United States, barely recognizes, and that was this period of relative stability and peace, where his father served as a colonel in the Afghan National Army, in a multi-ethnic army, and Ahmad Shah Massoud's own childhood reflected this. You know, he moved to Helmand as a child, and then to Herat, and then to Kabul, and of course, his enemies paint him as a provincial. You know, that use of the word Panjshiri that almost has a sort of snarl attached to it that his enemies have managed to mainstream in some places. You know, of course, he belongs so profoundly to Panjshir, but his life was not in any way provincial. And that leads to the second sort of note about his biography, which is, how central education was to the kind of pluralism of his own approach to war and politics. He went when he was in Kabul as a teenager. Of course, he went to the lycée and acquired some French, and also then to the Polytechnic, where he very well could have been an outstanding engineer and mathematician. And then we all know the images late in his life, in the Panjshir and where in difficult conditions and in some isolation from the world, he managed to maintain a very rich library that he used quite meaningfully right to the end. And I know that idea resonates in Afghanistan so far beyond his life, but it is perhaps not the first thing that we think about with him. And so I thought I would put it on my list. The third thing I wanted to mention was just his skill as a politician, which is, perhaps, he was no doubt a greater military tactician and commander than he was a politician, but he was also a successful politician and a very fully realized politician who was forced by circumstances into many of the realms that politics requires. So that includes participation in leadership of a political party that's bigger than yourself, and certainly not a cult of personality. That would be true of Jamiat, and having to share power with seniors, even under great strain and with tensions, but managing to hold things together, building a sense of mobilization through the possibility of political parties. And that was part of his life, a big part of his life, especially from university into the war. And his skill in negotiating with his enemies, his interest in alliances as a strategy, and his ability, as politicians do, not always attractively, to live with so many contradictions. In his case, I think of how he ran this very successful operation in Pakistan, even when he was a sworn enemy of Pakistan for good reason, and ISI dealt with him in a complicated way for some years, but then it became rather uncomplicated, and yet he managed to leverage his access to the international sort of supply lines through Pakistan with some real sophistication, and he managed to make the most out of his office in Pakistan to strengthen himself. And that kind of leads to the fourth of my 5 notes. One, just I'm sure others have remarked on, that he was such a creature of the wider world, and particularly he developed, as great statesmen do, a portfolio of alliances with some global understanding and vision, a portfolio of alliances that strengthened his own independence, and when he was in power in Afghanistan, strengthened Afghanistan's independence. So, of course, in the United States, we obsess about ourselves, and so our history of contact with Massoud, which was certainly fairly minor, with some exceptions in the late 80s. But when those CIA officers who did maintain ties under constraints with him in the late 1990s, when they then arrived after 9/11 in the Valley to try to really build up the alliance to overthrow the Taliban, who did they encounter? Of course, they encountered officers from Iran and Russia. India was already there. And of course, the British were in contact with Massoud during the 80s before the Americans, and had a clearer sense of why they wanted to build up that relationship than the Americans did, at least initially. And it was, and the French had their own ties to him as well. So you look at figures, comparable figures in the history of guerrilla movements, military political movements, not so many who have had such a portfolio of long-lasting and well-resourced alliances such as he built. And then finally, there is just who he was in the landscape of political figures in Afghanistan. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize him, and we shouldn't inflate his political achievements, which were limited in his lifetime. But his personal tolerance, combined with his fierce clarity about his enemies and the enemies of an independent Afghanistan, a plural Afghanistan. Very rare, I think, and that's one reason why we're still here talking about it. And we think about what Afghanistan has lost and what it faces this summer. I think of those qualities and the prospect that they will have to be reestablished through a very long struggle once again. Lastly, I was thinking, so many of us, even if we could see this outcome coming, couldn't help but be shocked by the particular events of August. And I wonder if he would have been surprised. Maybe not. He did have He did have to evacuate Kabul in 1996, though he worked very hard to prevent that and was sort of betrayed. I'm sure he would have seen around these corners better than most of us. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, and I hope that events will bring us together the old-fashioned way soon.